Welcome everybody. Can everybody hear us okay? I'm Carmel Mawle with Writing for Peace, and I'm here with Bradley Wetzler, who is also a member of our board. He's a writer and journalist, and we are welcoming Erin Soros to join us today. Welcome.
Hello. I know Phil's trying to get in. He asked me for the password, and then I didn't know I had it. I did have it, but he should be. Was on the phone just a minute ago with me.
Okay. Well, we see people coming in still.
Okay.
And I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just mute people as they come in so we can start.
Okay.
And I wanted to start with just reading the short bio so people, just to introduce people to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very impressive, I must say, Erin. Erin Soros is a postdoctoral fellow in the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, where she is researching psychoanalytic conceptions of psychic energy and psychosis as a response to trauma. She has published in international anthologies and journals, including short fiction, the Iowa Review, and the Indiana Review, and her stories have been produced for the CBC and BBC as winners of the CBC Literary Award, Commonwealth Award for the short story. Her academic articles weave together psychoanalysis, philosophy, and autobiographical narratives. Her work has appeared in Literature of Madness, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and in Women and the Psychosocial Construction of Madness, Lexington Press. Soros has been a visiting writer at 4 universities, most recently as the Harper Wood Fellow at St. John's College at the University of Cambridge. She was also a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto, where she researched correspondences and tensions between indigenous and settler understandings of the mind. She has received a Fulbright Award, the Governor General's Gold Medal, and 2 teaching awards, including Columbia University's Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching. Sorry about the background noise.
He's like, I want to go to Cambridge.
Oh, well.
Call Phil. I'm just worried that because he invited me and he's not here. I just talked to him a minute ago.
Yeah, let's see, make sure he can get in real quick.
Yeah.
Come here, Max.
I'll just see, because he's in his room trying to get on. I don't know if there was a problem.
Oh, you got, okay.
No, it's going through to voicemail. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's been on before, so I think hopefully he'll find that.
Yeah.
Do you wanna try to reach him, or there you go. My husband try to call him. So
beautiful room. The light coming through the is that a porch?
We're underneath the deck.
So
here.
lovely.
Yeah, thank you. So everybody, does anybody have any questions about, was everybody able to read the piece, the link that we included? That's the Puritan link.
Yeah, the Puritan essay.
Yeah, really beautiful. And I hate to have you start reading now before everybody gets on, but I know that Phil has read the piece.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I really would like to hear some of this in your voice.
Yeah, I'd be happy to read it. It was written it was published, but it was written as a performance.
Really?
So, yeah, I gave it as a performance, not a theater performance, but a kind of literary performance. So yeah.
Oh, how cool. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm not sure. Do you have you probably have a better feel for how long it would take to read the whole thing?
Yeah, it'll be about 25 minutes.
Okay. Well, why don't we start?
Part of it, or
there's Sandy. Why don't we start by reading the first page and then all the way down to from Dion Brand's long poem "Thirsty."
Okay.
About halfway down the second page. What do you think?
Stop at Dion Brand's "Thirsty." Stop there.
or if you, yeah, either there or right before there. I think that kind of introduces a new
Yeah,
subject.
sure.
So,
That sounds good. Yeah.
okay.
Okay. That's excellent. Thank you. That's a good cutoff. I'm reading from my phone because I'm not, I don't have a printer, and I'm trying to still avoid going, interacting with the, with the COVID risk. So I'm kind of limiting my exposure. So I didn't print it, but so I'm reading from my phone. So, um, but yeah, I can see it fine. Okay. Who could have lived? No one wakes up thinking of a stranger, a life away, falling.
That's fine. That's good. Thank you so much.
I'll back up. I'll say it again. No one wakes up thinking of a stranger, a life away, falling. Dion Brand, thirsty. It isn't my neighborhood. It isn't my car either, but I seem to be driving it, my slick hands slipping on the steering wheel of this borrowed vehicle that carries me in such a protected fashion through my city, the car's gleaming metal skin between myself and the people who like to lurch their legs right in front of traffic on Main Street, as if to say a human body could be value enough to stop 2 tons of gasoline-powered steel. They flaunt sloppy smiles and missing teeth, and bruises on cheeks, and tracks on arms, like the ones that once marked my brother. I follow signage, storefronts, street signs, even the words on people's t-shirts directing me to the next light. Each sign holds a secret code, and if you read them all together, they form one long, beautiful sentence that will tell me where I can find my beloved. Let's call him B. That bulbous letter we learn to shape so soon after the first one that is all straight lines like these streets. I keep driving past Granville Street and turning on Burrard Street, along Burrard Bridge, 2 letter B's under the lucid blue sky, and I know it isn't safe for me to be driving, not when every piece of the alphabet is ricocheting within the car, even now when I'm no longer rattling down Seymour Street, but see more and more sky above as if the car could lift right into the horizon. I park the car a few blocks west of South Granville, where the lawns are green and the house is tidy and people obey crosswalks, no one chicken dancing against all the rolling wheels. I throw away the keys, or at least they're gone. Those keys to that car that is not mine. And I know this neighborhood really isn't mine any more than the last one, but I am walking through it now and asking strangers, so many strangers, if they can help me find liberty, the store where my sister works, where I am sure my family is holding the surprise wedding. Sunlight glints off glass storefronts. On South Granville, the women are wearing heels and the men talking to smartphones. No one I pass has signs on their t-shirts. I modulate my voice to sound reasonable. Excuse me, can you tell me where to find liberty? They say left, and I think about being left wing. I think about being left, how my beloved has left me. Now I'm sure B can be found if I could just turn left, but I've turned left too many times. And again, I ask a stranger and she says right. And I think of human rights and my right to be free of that other human. Let's call him D, the man who harassed me at an American college so far from this shiny, bright neighborhood that is not mine. I can see his face now in the faces of strangers. Even though I have flown away from that American college where D once left a gift inside my locker, inside the woman's changing room, private space, inside private space. But here I am in public. Here these are the people of the neighborhood, the shopkeeper, and the hairdresser, and the waitress in the restaurant where I asked to use the washroom, and I am once more in a private space. And as I wash my hands, I can hear the lyrics on the sound system, giving me clues about how to escape D and find B. And I am looking for freedom. I am looking for liberty. Can you tell me where to find liberty? On Thursday, August 9th, 2007, I am involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric facility, restrained to a bed, my arms and legs bound, my body locked within solitary confinement behind a double door. On Monday, August 13th, 2007, the day I am released from solitary, still unfree, but at least allowed to wander the ward and to speak to the other patients. Vancouver police confront Paul Glenn Boyd on South Granville. He walks incoherent on the same street that I had wandered just days before. He recognizes friends in the features of strangers. He swings a bike chain and then releases the bike chain and uses his hands instead to crawl on the ground as 8 bullets puncture his flesh. That long street, that innocent weekend, together form a hinge, joining one mad woman to one mad man, both gap and connection between life and death. This essay is about moments that neighbor each other. It is about the minutes and seconds before the police arrive. It is about people who pass each other, who by some accident of proximity become for a fleeting time neighbors. It is about what I long to say as a neighbor to those who could have lived. On that bed, my bound limbs formed a letter X. All the voices in the psychiatric ward crossed out.
That is so beautiful and so powerful and so unfortunately timely. This essay is.
It was hard to get through. I mean, just to think of the echoes right now.
Mm-hmm. And this is from 2007, so sadly, not much has changed since then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder, well, first of all, are there questions from people in the group? Does anybody have questions? You can raise your hand here. What's that? Or just unmute yourself, yeah. Okay, I wonder if you could talk a little bit. Your writing here reminds me a little bit of Virginia Woolf in the sense.
Oh my gosh!
in the sense of the sort of the stream of consciousness. You write about the way the mind works here in a really unusual way, and you know, here the signs, you know, follow signage, storefronts, street signs, and then the way your mind is sort of interpreting these things, and lyrics on the sound system, and it's all, it makes it all very real, but at the same time, you know, you're very conscious that it's not real, but it's real to you, and it becomes real to us as the reader.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Can you talk a little bit about how you did that, or what you were thinking when you began putting this together, and what your
Yeah,
process.
it's flattering. I was obsessed by Virginia Woolf when I was an undergrad, so I read everything that I could find that was published of hers. So, and I do. It's not conscious now but when I'm interested, like Toni Morrison, H.D., Virginia Woolf, there's certain writers, Baldwin, who have rhythm in their prose, and I read it aloud to myself. I'm almost like trying to eat the rhythm. So when I'm writing, I don't think about the rhythm, but it's in there. And then the association, that's sort of, I'm trying to I think there's an intensity with which I view the world, so I'm trying to capture that. But I'm also trying to capture the ways that it's sort of, there's an aliveness that gets not dangerous, I don't want to use that word, but gets frightening. It's sort of the tipping over point where there's a kind of associative aliveness and noticing, and then you can sense that the person is also in the narrator is trying to hold something together, is trying to find liberty, is trying to find a place, that there's some kind of sense of things aren't okay in that piece. So I was trying to get that through the layering of associations, but also kind of through the rhythm of the prose. And the moving into the kind of nonsense, like when somebody says turn left, they don't mean turn left wing or right, like that. I'm trying to capture that is a kind of psychotic thinking. It's a hyper associative thinking, and I'm trying to sort of show you that movement. But I'm also trying to capture when I do public speaking in an educational capacity, I try to communicate that madness is not something I've cornered. I think the mind experiences that. I think we all, you drive to work and there's a billboard and it reminds you of your ex. You're often running, thinking about your ex, and you don't think the billboard is literally giving you messages.
Right.
But there is that associative, you fall in love and the radio comes on and the song, you realize you're in love because you connect to the song. That sort of way that the external and interior worlds work. I think we recognize madness more than we would like to know. In times of grief, in times of rupture, in times of falling in love, that kind of intensities, where the world shimmers in a way. When we see the associations of the external world, and they're helping us see our internal world.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get people to see both. I had a unique experience. It is me. It is not a biographical essay, but I'm more interested in the vulnerability of the mind itself, as opposed to something that like my narrow identity and what that means. But this is actually something that in certain circumstances the mind breaks, and being curious. What I also find I'm very interested in, I'm in dialogue with neuroscientists and people who are doing brain research, and they're so uncurious about the brain, like its expression. Like there's a kind of looking at the brain, which I find really interesting. But when I ask about how the associations in language happen in psychotic states, there isn't much work on that. They talk about clang associations. Well, clang associations is a kind of poetry gone mad. So it's taking a word and playing with it and opening it, and but there isn't a curiosity about why is that a move? This sort of movement to association. So I think of madness as a language event. Either in my case, going hyper-associative, or for people who are in deep grief or depressed, there's a kind of limiting of association. Does that make sense? So how to capture that? But what I was interested in doing, and I did that with that piece where I cut it with the poetry or with more lucid moments, because if I did it for pages and pages, you would start to lose. People admire Finnegan's Wake, but they're not reading it really. So. Yeah. There's a limit to what people will take in. So that's why I would kind of move back and forth.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, you can wind up in a psychotic ward, but the man gets shot and killed. And so obviously part of the point of the text is, the difference in social position that I hate to use the word privileges.
That's true.
Certain kinds of psychosis or certain kinds of associative thinking, and totally denies it.
Yeah. It's
to
interesting
to other people. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I thought you were finished. Go ahead, continue.
No, no, I think, no, that's enough said, really.
Well, I was thinking of this. I've never seen a more brutal painting, brutal awareness of hierarchy as in a psych ward. Both that there are different disorders that are hierarchized. So depression is more romantic and you're treated better. Psychosis is the worst. But in psychosis, people from Rwanda and the Congo were treated more poorly than I was, because I was at one point hospitalized in the UK. I have white skin, good teeth. They found out pretty soon I was in a PhD program. It's really apparent what privilege does, and it gives you literally physical freedom and leave from the ward. But what's interesting to see is, and it's also, I'm interested in its madness being racialized, it's also gendered, because the idea, their fear in the essay that I write in the about institutionalized rape, their fear was that if I was left on my own, that I would be assaulted or something. There was a sense of white womanhood needs to be protected, but they're doing this draconian violation to protect me of the thing that they think is going to happen to me. And I'm like, well, this is what it is. This is what you think would happen to me, is the thing you're doing. But it is I actually, when I've heard people critique, I'm interested in Black studies, and I've had scholars critique white people moving through Black studies because you're not as aware of the presence of your white body in the field, like what that means. And I have a terrible and visceral awareness of, I've had the police handcuff me and throw me to the ground first and handcuff me. And in that moment, I know I am saying to myself that I'm not going to become any white. And every death is ricocheting like a cubist painting in my head, and I'm holding on desperately to whiteness. And that's not a good thought to have in those cases where I actually feared for my life, because you're kind of going, is it going to hold? Is it not going to hold? But you know deeply what the limit of what the police will do. So it's not like madness is or mental illness is medicalized now, but it's shot through with the ways that politics are organized in our society.
I don't want to push this too far, but it's not just medicalized, but it's also made into literature.
That's interesting. Yeah.
We have a literature of madness, and we recognize its conventions.
Well,
and we interpret it, and we can deconstruct it, and that's not something we're willing to do with, the associative thinking of other people. Not willing to call that, literature or even, civilized expression.
Well, think of the skill you need to read The Bluest Eye, like the associations at the end of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, or the skill you need to enter the associations that you said, Carmel, about Virginia Woolf, or Ulysses, or even read the hallucinations in Hamlet or the hallucinations in Macbeth. We don't give that same intensity of reading to the homeless guy who comes in the store and he's just, he's nonsense. But when Hamlet sees something or hears something, when Macbeth sees a sword floating, we unpack that. And I feel the same people who would unpack that and talk about that with their students for several hours wouldn't talk to somebody who was off in their classroom. They would they would get that student out.
Yeah. That's the point.
Yeah. So the piece that you were just talking about, I call this institutionalized rape.
Yeah.
I don't know if you got my email about.
I did. I have had such a busy week. Okay. I've had interviews this week, so I've been very distracted. But I'm thrilled. That was so exciting.
Okay,
I'd be delighted.
Thank you. I'll just let everybody know that we'll be able to read that full essay in our resistance issue of Dovetails, edited by Brad Wetzler on August 1st. So I hope you'll look forward to that. It's a very powerful essay. I've read 3 of your pieces so far, and one is more an academic paper.
Yeah.
What is it about the indigenous madness literature in indigenous cultures?
Mm-hmm.
And that was very interesting. It also kind of informs what you're talking about right now with how we are, how we hear those the madness differently in different cultures. Is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Yeah, and also that there's several. So I've got something in my eye. There's several movements in that. One is I'm interested in. You can see now what's happening with people responding to the Black Lives Matter protest. People are wanting to be like suddenly make statements and include. But there's work to be done. There's deep reading to be done. It's not just about adding something or making a statement. And for me to be reading Indigenous literature, that's why I called it a hesitation, because my training isn't in Indigenous literature. It's not in oral traditions. It's in a very specific European kind of training. And so I was thinking, I'd like to bring my skills to that literature, but how, and this is a question I ask of people doing Indigenous studies. It's also a question I ask of people doing interdisciplinary studies. That how do we write well and rigorously with hesitation?
Yeah.
So it's precise and it's careful, and you're adding something to the conversation. You're not sort of flailing around going, oh, I don't know anything. Well, who am I to say? But you're doing something careful, but also acknowledging the limitations of your knowledge and sort of stepping humbly through it.
Yeah.
It's like, for example, I'm interested in Black studies, but I'm never going to have the depth of somebody who's only doing that field. I work between fields, and I feel like we don't have a lot of training in academic settings in how to write uncertainty, how to push something forward and not be sure and stay with the not sureness.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the not sureness was that like the ethics of where do you publish this work? Whose audience is it for? Is this another kind of colonial reframing of something for a readership outside of Indigenous communities?
Mm-hmm.
So that I wanted to put that hesitation on the page. I talk to my students often when they come to my office and say, I can't do this and I'm struggling with this and I don't know how to write the essay because of this. I'm like, well, that's the essay. Like, bring the struggle to the page, bring the problem. Mm-hmm. So that was one move. The other move is that looking at how Indigenous literature, like Phil was saying, it figures trauma and it figures madness. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't do so in a way that is pathologized. It's a concern for a community. It's a concern for the person going through it. But the way through it isn't hospitalization. The way through it is deep listening, transformation. Some kind of change has to happen, not just for the individual, but for the community around them. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with history. It has to do with ritual. It has to do with a movement forward through ritual and through acknowledging a history. So it's a profound shift. So it's not just, give this person these pills and exclude them from society. It's about what do we need to hear and how can we hear it? What change has to happen? And so that interested me. The other thing that I'm weaving through that is the very disciplines that we're in. We're building on Enlightenment traditions that have built the Indigenous other, has built the Black other as outside reason, outside philosophy. And so how do you think and reason through something that is madness and indigeneity when those have been collapsed in a colonial framework? And that's where I was trying to bring in, I was doing certain moves. I figured this in the essay, I say this, I'm not an archival scholar, I'm not a historian, there's certain skills I don't have, but I can stop and think about my dad's vocabulary of like being bush means that you've gone crazy from being in the woods.
Yeah.
And going native means you've gone crazy. He didn't use that term, but I know that term. So thinking like that is telling you something about where madness lies. The cusp of coloniality in Canada was the indigenous figure in the woods, was the threat of their threat. And it wasn't just threat to your life, it was a threat to reason. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a paradox to be applying and coaching through an essay and having analysis and argument and moving it through and trying to be rigorous and trying to be scholarly, when actually those moves have created the Indigenous as the mad other, as the thing to be analyzed. There's also, I don't know as much I was talking to Phil earlier about this today, the structures of racism in Canada and the US are quite different. So in Canada, there was idea of the one drop, there all these rules about protecting whiteness. In Canada, the colonialism was that indigeneity would be absorbed into the white body. So it was about breeding out indigeneity and erasing it. Mm-hmm. So it's not a better racism, it's just a reversed race, it's just a different structure. And we had years of key political figures who wrote beautiful poems about the dying Indigenous woman. So that the Indigenous figure as part of a colonial, like the very people who were setting up the Indian Act about stripping land were writing poems about Indigenous characters. Mm. So I have this hesitation about doing this work, that I can do all I want, but we know this from that a word, so sir, a letter signifies into relationship to other letters. My texts are going to signify in relationship to colonial history. I don't have complete control over how someone is going to read my text. It's going to signify in relationship to other circumstances. I have an example of that. I published a short story with an Indigenous character in it, and I had the English woman was reading it, and she said, he's a Inuvialit, so he's from the Arctic, so Inuit, like the Eastern Inuit. And she said, yeah, you could tell he's really hot. Hmm. And there was no references in the story to his sexuality. There was no description of his physicality. There was nothing. And it was a kind of interesting, it was like, but there is the hot, the ways that it's framed, that it was in the story and it wasn't in the story.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
So that I don't know how this can be read, because people reading it don't know the history of the banning of the potlatch, don't know the Indian Act, don't know the Balfour Agreement, don't know the larger history. And if I did that larger history, it would be much larger than the essay. So it's always kind of point to what isn't there and what needs to be there. So it's such a small effort, but so like the structure of shifting of learning has to be so enormous sometimes. I get both excited and overwhelmed at the possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It is kind of a challenging time. There's all this makes me think of American Dirt. There's a lot of talk about appropriation, and and some very, very important points made, especially when it comes to the publishing industry and all of that. But there is a question about, so do we only write what we know, or how do we step beyond those lines? This is actually the challenge that we do for young writers, and we've just had a couple hundred entries from all over the country writing about another culture, writing from the point of view of a character within another culture, and trying to avoid stereotypes and find commonalities and research what types of pressures, outside pressures they have in those cultures. And when all of this stuff about American Dirt and some of these other examples began being talked about so much, I had second thoughts about our challenge, but ultimately, we've decided that it's a valuable exercise. But you who have done so much study into this and written so successful about these questions, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about, what, how you've approached this. You already have a little bit, but also, how to avoid some of those pitfalls. What types of things should we watch out for?
Specifically around writing about cultures that aren't my own?
Right.
Yeah, it's a question I think about a lot. And I could tell you an example, which is an easy example for me. But you know the shipping news, Annie Proulx's shipping news.
Mm-hmm.
I have family on the East Coast. I come from fishing family on the East Coast. That's a party trick, that book. People read aloud lines and laugh their heads off because it's so bad. And it's so successful. And people, when I moved to New York, people were bringing it up to me. And I'm like, get that book. Like, it's literally, people will read aloud and laugh their heads off because she gets it so wrong. Like, it's embarrassingly wrong. Like, the basic things, like people don't drink that shit, or they don't use that word. Like, it's just like riddled with errors. So if you, like, I write about logging communities. I come from a logging family. I do my research, and it's not just like field work. It's bonds and responsibilities, and it's ethics. And when I work with Indigenous communities, when I learn from Indigenous communities, I also give back. Like I'm a go-between for Indigenous people to be publishing their own work. I support other people's careers. I'm committed. I do reading groups in elder care homes. I give reading groups in Indigenous teen centers. I mentor people like Indigenous young people, especially young people who've had mental health problems. So, and that is something I've learned from that. Like, we think we get to sit in an institution and decide what an ethical system is, but we're talking amongst each other in a colonial institution. Indigenous communities have ethics about what stories are to be told, and I've learned some of those ethics and those things, like what I just talked about, reciprocity. What are you giving back to the community? And also, what story is yours to tell? There's a lot of stories that will never make the page. So when an elder tells me something and it's their story and they don't want it repeated, I might learn from that and I don't repeat it. So I also think about, in my piece, my stories are told from a white woman's perspective. I'm not saying it can't be done to tell from the Indigenous person's perspective. I know I don't have enough information. I have deep connections. I've lived in the Arctic. I have deep bonds and responsibilities. I talked to an elder, and he said, how long you'd been here for? And I said, 3 months. And he said, yeah. He said, yeah, if you're here 18 years, you might know something. You know, and I think what he's telling me is like my book would be a party trick. If I thought I could, you know, but basing, my book is based in a logging camp. I know my dad's a logger. My dad was a logger. My grandfather was a logger. My grandmother was a cook in a logging camp. And the men that are in the camp are Indigenous men logging. And I have bonds in communities, people who read my work, Indigenous people who read it and come back to me. It's relationship built, right? And then also Alicia Elliott, she talks about, she's an Anishinaabe writer, sorry, not Anishinaabe, just a Haudenosaunee writer. She Tuscarora and Mohawk writer in the Haudenosaunee community. She writes about the difference between writing with empathy, which is still sort of like, here I am, whole, and I'm connecting with you, and the difference between that and actually writing with love, and what it means to be writing with love. And she says you can feel it when somebody's writing with love and genuine commitment to a community, as opposed to, this is going to be something I'm going to stitch through my book because it's kind of exotic. And when I've had people ask me, I've had people write to me and go, I want to write about this community, and I'll outline the things they might want to do to connect, and they actually back off because it's a lot of work. It's not just pick up a book and Google it and Wikipedia something. Right. It's about, well, what are your commitments to that community? And it's a different way of thinking about writing. And this is Phil knows I'm interested in Paul Deman. It's thinking about writing as a form of action. When you create that text, it has an ethical effect in the world. And what is it going to be? Is it going to hurt people? So I'm deeply concerned about my representations. And not because I want a good review or a tick box that I'm a good white person, but because I know my text can hurt people. So I want people to feel not elevated in a way that every Indigenous character is a good character. That's kind of bullshit. But I want them to feel that there was love on the page. But these questions are not, I did an MFA program, and it was all about the freedom of the imagination. And the imagination, that construction is a colonial construction. The imagination is racist. It's got a history. So this idea of the freedom of the imagination, well, we were looting cultures for centuries. So we need to think about that history. And when I talk to students in the MFA program, often they had no idea of that history.
Mm.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done before people can do work. And also, when I am figuring stories, I'm figuring not in the same way as that essay, but I'm figuring some of the hesitations.
Yeah.
I'm putting things on the page that you realize, am I really getting that guy, that Anuvialowit guy she's interested in? Am I really getting access to him, or am I getting access to her fantasy of him? So I'm putting that on the page in terms of the uncertainty of what she is actually seeing.
Thank you. That's helpful. Do we have, I'm going to take it off of, or maybe Craig, you can take it off of mute for everybody. I'd like to, if any questions or comments from participants, now's your chance, because I'm going to ask her to read something else. Let's see. Do you have an idea of where else you would like to read? Is there anything?
Let's see. Maybe the closing of the call this institutionalized rape piece, or I could read the part. It's quite, to me, it's, I don't know if it reads powerfully, but I'll try to find it just a second. Sorry, I would have had that ready.
Does anybody have any questions for Erin?
Yeah.
No, I need to go now, but I just want to thank you. This was very, very interesting. I enjoyed participating in this, hearing you. Thank you all.
Thank you. You look beautiful with the light falling on your face.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Jenny.
You're very welcome. I'll come back for more later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'm just looking up for the essay. I just sent it to Phil because I have to find it on my phone. Okay, here it is.
You know what I'm looking at right now is a essay that I'm working with, and it's called "The Impact of Islamic Writing on Oral Cultures of West Africa."
Oh.
And what it's by a famous anthropologist named Jack Goody, and you probably know who he is, Erin.
But who?
And Jack Goody.
Jack Goody. No, I don't think I do.
Oh, well, he writes about writing and literacy.
Oh, I have to read that.
And he exemplifies the colonial notion of writing that you're talking about. The notion that writing rationalizes everything. And that it divides between the sane and the insane. And that it allows us to put time into an orderly pattern and to carry ideas from one place to the other, and to preserve ideas from one generation to another, and to keep records. And that's the colonial idea of writing, right? Which is which is very pragmatic, and which is very much an Enlightenment idea, right? You would say that that's very much, and it's Enlightenment anthropology, right? That you have this Western culture that just kind of straightens things out. And where do you think we can find a place in this Western culture for the kind of empathy and loving communication between writers and subjects that you're talking about? Because that idea is very attractive to me. It's very compelling to me. That I would like to write like that. I mean, I don't write like that. But it seems to me that that would be a good idea. So
yeah, I get struggle.
How do you have a kind of program for how it might be done, or a kind of theory or a kind of way of thinking about it?
Well, there's are you meaning like in a university setting or beyond a university setting?
Yeah, I mean beyond a university setting, because I think that, the conventional view, well, for a long time, and I think a lot of people are coming around to something like your view, but for a long time, Goody's view was pretty dominant in terms of how literacy worked and what a good thing it was. And one of the things that you say in your paper is that words are neighbors to each other. And you continue that, in the same way that people are neighbors with each other, and ideas are neighbors with each other. That's very suggestive to me.
Yeah, and this is where the question, the reason I paused is I feel like, it sounds grandiose, but I feel like my life's work or my life's commitment is response to that question, Phil, because I feel like I have this training to teach students how to read a certain way and pay attention to a pronoun, or pay attention to when a writer is hyphenating a word in a poem. Why are they hyphenating it? And so I took that training, which was an elite training, and when I was in a psych ward for months, the fifth admission, I was in a psych ward for months, and I was with schizophrenic people, and they were speaking in poetry, and there was static, but I'm used to editing poetry. I work with students, so there's static in poetry. Like, you take out extra words, you realize you get the essence, and I feel I don't want to put it on. I don't want to bring examples because I don't want to say the anecdote because they're quite painful. But people would say things that were so truthful. Like, if you think of the pain in your life, like the pain, the worst romantic rejection, the grief of a childhood, or the grief of losing a parent, or losing, something intense, the sentence that would hook that pain, they would speak that sentence in the midst of something that we would say is gibberish. And they would do it in a way that would unhook. Okay, you would ask them about a stone they were carrying, or a shell, or a gum wrapper, and the gum wrapper would be their mother or something. There would be something yellow about the gum wrapper that reminded them of the yellow of the tea towel. Like, it would be, and I didn't find nonsense there. I found poetry, and I just felt like, why isn't anyone listening to this?
Yeah.
Nobody was listening in the psych ward. It was seen as gibberish. And so what I'm interested, Phil, is trying to figure out, and I just had an interview today, which is why I was distracted, Carmel, is I had an interview today about doing psychotherapeutic training. And my goal is to not do the training so that I'm working one-on-one in a little sheltered office, but to do the kind of training of people, neighbors. How can we listen to each other with a psychoanalytic insight? Not that we're analyzing each other, but we step back, and we do see each other as neighbors. Everyone, not just the neighbor that can own property next to you. But if you see somebody on the bus, and you're on a subway and they're rambling to themselves, don't just go, oh, it's just nonsense. Listen, they're talking, they're sharing something, and listen in. And what I grieve is that we're fixated on the police, which I think we need to critique the police, but there's moments before the police are called. And in Canada, there's been 2 people recently, and both of them were in mental health crisis. One was Black, one was Indigenous. They were both in mental health crisis, and they were killed. And Pierre Correlon, a few years ago, I write about him in the essay. He was in a mental health crisis. He was tearing apart his own bedroom, unarmed, and he was shot by the police. Now, if a 16-year-old boy, anybody with a mother who has a 16-year-old boy, if he's tearing apart his room, you don't go shoot him. You figure out, what is he trying to tear apart? What is happening? He's obviously not communicating well. Something's upset him, but there was no one to hear. We've left it. We've so criminalized, and this gets back to the way that madness is racialized. It's the threat. It's dangerous. So there's video evidence of the police killing him and he's holding nothing in his hands, and he's on the floor. And I think unless you see the evidence, that whiteness has made that unbelievable. Like, now we have evidence, but Black people didn't need that evidence. A lot of mad people didn't need that evidence.
Okay.
And so I think about, what does it mean before we call the police? What does it mean to be a neighbor with each other? And to see the homeless person on the block. I lived in Toronto. The people on my street were my neighbors. The people I offered change to, I got to know them, and they had interesting things to teach me. And that's another thing I think about teaching, is we've got something so wrong about our society, that we have this idea of who teaches. My mom has a grade 10 education. She has a lot to teach me, and I teach her. Like, education didn't stop. My dad is reading Ta-Nehisi Coates and reading Black Studies in Canada. He's this like white retired logger who's 87, but his learning hasn't stopped. But we have such a colonial, like, it's such a weird little pragmatic 4-year entry into adulthood, and then we're done, as opposed to seeing it as an adventure throughout our lives. I mean, you obviously are living that, but I think that this contemporary crisis is a crisis of justice, but it's also a crisis of education.
Interesting. Yeah.
No.
So
No, it's very fine.
I just wanted to make sure that anybody has a question or comment. This is our last chance, because we're running out of time here. And
I have so many big thoughts that I don't want to take away from Erin's chance to read again, but I'm fascinated, and so I'm going to find everything I can of yours and read more about it, because I think I'm working in much of the same pathway as you are, specifically in the LGBT community, and which I am a part of, but I do a lot of writing about the transgender population.
Right.
Because I have a platform and I have a means to do so, and it requires a constant delicacy, and I am finding it frustrating in a piece of writing that I have, where I have alternating narrators, and the readers gravitate towards the white male who's very easy to understand but a real jerk, and they love him because he's such a big personality. But the other character, who has all the subtlety of saying things that another veteran who's been through a combat situation gets everything this person says, but I haven't quite mastered how to communicate that to the everyday reader, because there's a skimming through of the simple sentences, and it's flat compared to the vibrant jerk. But in reality, this younger veteran who's experiencing all this PTSD really says so much in such a compressed way. And so that really comes down to my writing skill that I need to continue to work through. But I know where it needs to be, because those small expressions contain the universe that this person is living in.
And that's what I said about poetry. I don't mean like pretty or decorative or lilting. It's just the compactness and the power of a simple sentence that kind of cracks open. You know, like one man, he welcomed me and he said, he was schizophrenic, and he was kind of clangy and said, I'm a Methodist, there's a method to my madness. He was introduced, you know, and he kept repeating and playing on the word method, and there was such sense in that, right? Like, it was a kind of opening associative term, but he was saying there's a method in how I speak. Listen to me.
Thank you for listening.
Method.
Thank you for doing all the things you're doing, and I really look forward to reading more of your work, and I'm so glad that I got to be here tonight.
Thank you. Your work sounds fascinating.
Where do I get on there? Am I on?
Yes, you are.
On mute. Am I here?
Yes. Yeah, Sandra, you can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question, I'm not sure if I have it in my head correctly, but most of the experience that I've read about with Indigenous people is much of their world is oral, the oral tradition. So I hadn't thought about it as the Western culture usurping that and putting words that actually, I think, resonate better when they're told in story rather than printed on page. So the difficulty, the secrets of the Indigenous people sometimes do not want to be shared with whitey or whomever.
Well, there's even rules within Indigenous communities that there are rules that you can't repeat things even within Indigenous communities, or there's rules that some stories are only told in the wintertime. Like there's all sorts of ethics about which stories can be repeated and when and how. So again, it's about learning the ethics of a different tradition, and that means kind of rupturing your certainty that you have cornered ethics, and that there is one kind of way to be in a story, that is that humility of listening to a different ethical tradition. And it's fascinating to think about, or like how, because there's amazing Indigenous writers in Canada who've been publishing for decades. So there's a writer, she's got a collected poem. So there are textual traditions, but they work with orality on the page. So you have to kind of, and if you read it expecting to find Keats or Wordsworth, like you have to have different rhetorical, different training to read it. You have to be thinking about how it works in the same way that, you know, how Alice Munro's stories, they seem structurally seamless and like a realist story, but she makes the sentences, there's sentences in there that crack open, but you have to get that it's not just a New Yorker tidy short story. The more you read an Alice Munro story, the more layers you get on it, but it doesn't read like a Joycean riff, right? It seems effortless. And I think it's that kind of reading. But I also think it's interesting what we define, because I agree with you in terms of oral traditions and Indigenous, and these are deep traditions of memory and deep training in memory. So it's not just absence of literature. It was that orality had its own structure, which was a passing along traditions. But there were also many forms of literacy that weren't alphabetic. So you had like the Tua Wampum Belt, for example, was a form of law created in beads. So beads being a kind of a sign system. So there were many, you know, or working with bark, doing different things. There were many ways of passing along knowledge, but this was a Daniel Heath Justice, a Cherokee scholar, that he talks about the forms of literacy that existed pre-colonial. So I think the question is much more complex than what I could have answered in that one essay.
My screen froze. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, you looked aghast at what I was saying. I'm kidding.
Well, do we have time for just a little bit more reading?
Oh, that's good.
Could you read a little bit more, Erin?
Yeah, I'll read a couple pieces from. Let's see.
How did that happen?
I'm just thinking of where I could read that's less. I'll just read a couple of the more personal pieces because I think these read better than the more theoretical. There's theoretical work in this essay, which I think it's better for them. I mean, they both. I've read them both, but I think I want to read this because it's quite powerful for me to share this. The drugs were created to last days in my system. So after an initial series of weekly doses, the involuntary injections occurred only every 2 weeks. Before each dose, I read aloud a statement. I call this institutionalized rape, the statement began. And then I detailed how I would be submitting to the injection only because otherwise I would be restrained by force. My submission should in no way be construed as consent. You were doing this against my will. At the end of the statement, I explained that one day I would write and publish an essay titled, I call this institutionalized rape. Which that's true.
Wow.
I did actually, every time that I got the injection, I had a statement prepared and I said, one day I'm going to write this and publish this essay.
Yeah, and you did, and there's no hiding what was done. And I loved it when the nurse came in and asked you to stop saying that.
Yeah.
And,
they actually saw it as evidence that I was crazy. So everything I did was evidence. They actually have notes in my file, which I actually want to write an essay called Bright Mismatched Colors, because I like color, and they have a notes in my file that I'm wearing bright mismatched colors. Which, so the sense of what was saying was so normative, and my colors, all I wear are various shades of periwinkles and blues and turquoises. Like a blind man could dress me and I would match. Like there was nothing, you know. So it was I said to a friend that it's just not that I wasn't matching. They just have no style. But and then they also had notes in my file. I wish I want to get my files because I would like to do a kind of archival poetic project with it. But they in the first my first admission, my file said she seems to think she has a position in England. Because what they did was and think about, I'm a privileged white woman in Vancouver, place of my birth. They did not believe me that I had a position in England. They asked me, because I said, they said, well, how did they ask you in this great, like you're talking to a 4-year-old, like, how did you get the job? And I said, well, they said, have you been to England? I said, no. And they said, did you have an interview? No. Well, how did you get the job? And I said, well, I found it on email. And they said, and what did you find on email? I said, well, that I won a contest. And they explained spam and like they thought I was being conned. So they explained that to me, that I didn't really have a position in England. They thought that was madness. And I was being injected with 5 drugs. So at that point, I completely, like, I didn't know what was real because they were telling me. So I thought that I had never been a writer. Like I started thinking, well, if that's fake, when did it, like, have I been schizophrenic since I was 18 and I've done none of this stuff? Like, is it all delusional? Like it was that much power. And so, and then I got to England, but they showed me the file. When I got to England, the psychiatrist showed me the file that said she seems to think she has a position in England. And if I couldn't be believed, I was in the psych ward with people from Congo and Rwanda with no trauma care, no awareness about what somebody would have witnessed from Rwanda, nothing, no listening, nothing. And they were in the psych ward for months. So this gets right back to me in terms of this crisis. The crisis is not just the carceral response of the police. Our forms of care are forms of silencing. And there are people in a psych ward who want to do good. Sometimes it's the janitor. Sometimes it's the server. Sometimes it is a good nurse. But the structure itself, it's really absolute power because there are no witnesses in a psych ward. Once you get in a psych ward, you're crazy. So anything you report. And if one of you walk through to visit someone, it changes. The dynamic changes in the ward. They treat patients differently because there's a witness in the room, because we are not witnesses. And I have another essay. It's interesting to me because I wrote this one about the institutionalized rape, but I want to think about what if I were actually raped with like sexual violence on the street? All my writing would be used against me, right? I am not a credible witness to my own life. What if I went through a sexual harassment case at Cornell? Who would, am I reliable? And it's interesting what Laura said about LGBT issues, because trans communities are also dismissed as mad, right? So the ways that oppressions and sanism, like they work together. And queer communities, I knew a woman in Vancouver who was a lesbian who was given shock treatments to cure her. This was decades ago, but it wasn't that long ago.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really important questions, and something needs to change there. And yeah. I feel like your writing is a step towards that. It's powerful, and it's very wise, and so the little bit that Erin just read is from the essay that will be published in August. So I hope everybody will look for that, because it is extremely powerful, as all of your writing is that I've seen. I look forward to reading more too.
It means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
It really does. My career was quite interrupted by these circumstances, so it's hard to have known the work I've done, but I didn't get a book out as in certain decades because I was dealing with all the crises. So it's a really beautiful thing to hear that. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being with us today and reading your work and talking us through some really important things that we need to think about. you know, you've given us a lot of food for thought. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. As everybody's muted, I think, but we'll yay, Erin! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you. I appreciate this, guys. I really appreciate meeting you. Thank you so much for your questions. Take
I
care,
look
everybody.
forward to talking to you some more later.
Thanks a lot. I would love that, Carmel. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.